The Mafia boss married his dead friend's spinster sister. Then he couldn't let her go. You don't have to honor this. Sarah Calloway's voice was calm. Deliberately calm, the way a person speaks when they have practiced the words so many times they no longer feel them. She stood in the doorway of her third-floor walk-up, one shoulder pressed against the frame, her arms crossed loosely at her waist. Not defensive, just contained, the way she always was. Rain came down hard against the window at the end of the hall. It had been raining since noon, the relentless, gray kind that makes the whole city feel smaller and colder and older than it is. Suarez Matteo hadn't moved from the threshold. He was exactly what Derek had described in those last weeks, and nothing like it. Tall, dark suit, no tie. His hands hung at his sides, tattooed from knuckle to wrist in ink so dark it looked carved. His jaw was set. His eyes were still. Not the stillness of a man who was calm, the stillness of a man who had already decided. Derek loved me, Sarah continued quietly. And men who are dying ask things of the living that the living were never meant to carry. I'm releasing you from it. Suarez looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her with the kind of attention that made the back of her neck prickle. The hallway light flickered overhead. Behind her, the apartment smelled of cold coffee and the faint damp that crept up from the walls every fall. A stack of envelopes sat on the table just inside the door. She hadn't moved them in time. Releasing me, he repeated. The words left his mouth slowly, like he was testing the weight of them. Derek didn't ask me to do you a favor, Suarez said. He asked me because he knew something was coming for you that you can't handle alone. That hasn't changed because he's gone. Sarah's chin lifted slightly. I've been handling things alone for a long time. I know, he said, and something in the way he said it, not with sympathy, not with pity, but with the flat certainty of a man who had been paying attention, made her breath catch in a way she couldn't immediately explain. He reached into his coat and produced a single folded envelope. He held it out. She didn't take it. That's Derek's handwriting, Suarez said. He wrote it for you, not for me. Read it before you release anyone from anything. Welcome to the channel. Before we go any deeper into the world of the Matteo Empire, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. And if you believe that people who have been quietly overlooked their whole lives deserve to have someone finally show up and fight for them, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. Sarah took the envelope. She didn't open it, not yet. She pressed it flat against her palm and looked at the handwriting on the front. Her name, Derek's hand, shaky at the end the way it had been those last months. Her throat tightened. She had told herself she was prepared for this conversation. She had rehearsed the refusal, the gracious exit, the clean and dignified release of a man who owed her nothing. She had been very sure of herself an hour ago. Suarez Matteo stood in her doorway in the rain-dark hallway of her third-floor walk-up, and Sarah Calloway understood, with the particular dread of a woman who has spent years being right about the wrong things, that she had not been prepared at all. This was the moment everything changed, not with a declaration, not with a demand, with a letter from a dead man and a living one who refused to look away. She didn't open the letter at the door. She stepped back, not an invitation, just a retreat, and Suarez took it as one. He moved inside without asking, and she didn't stop him. He closed the door behind him with the quiet click of a man who had closed 1,000 doors and never once slammed one. Sarah moved to the window. She needed something to look at that wasn't him. The rain had blurred the street below into streaks of orange and white, headlights, storefronts, the bodega on the corner with its neon sign buzzing in the wet. She pressed her thumb along the seal of the envelope and didn't open it. Not yet. She needed another moment to be the person she was before he knocked. How did Derek know? She asked. What was coming for me? How did he know? Behind her, she heard Suarez move, not toward her. She heard the low drag of a chair, her kitchen chair, the one with the uneven leg, and then the creak of it taking his weight. He found out 3 months before he died, Suarez said. Your cousin Penelope had been rerouting money. Small amounts, accounts your mother left in both your names. By the time Derek traced it, she'd been doing it for 4 years. Sarah's thumb stopped moving along the envelope seal. He wanted to confront her, Suarez continued. I told him not to, not yet. You don't move on someone like Penelope with anger. You move on her with something she can't argue with. A pause. He ran out of time before we got there. Sarah turned around. Suarez sat at her kitchen table like he belonged there, which was offensive given that the table was barely large enough for one, and the chair was visibly straining under the architecture of him. His forearms rested on the surface. His hands were still. She kept noticing his hands, the ink, the stillness, the way they looked like they had done things she would never ask about and wouldn't want the answer to if she did. How much, she said. Enough that you shouldn't still be living here. She absorbed that, filed it somewhere behind her sternum where she kept the things she wasn't ready to feel yet. And you think marrying you fixes that? I think marrying me means Penelope never touches another dollar that belongs to you. His voice didn't change. Same register. Same unhurried wait. And it means that when she tries the next thing, because there will be a next thing, she does it knowing you have the full attention of the Matteo family. Sarah leaned against the windowsill and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. Up close, under her bad apartment lighting, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had built something enormous and dangerous, and had the particular stillness of someone who no longer needed to prove it to anyone. You don't know me, she said. I know you better than you'd be comfortable with. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be. She opened the letter. Derek's handwriting was worse than she remembered, looser, the letters slightly uneven, the pen pressed too hard in places like he was willing the words to stay on the page. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. The way you read something when you're hopping the meaning will shift the second time. It didn't shift. Sarah, I should have said this when I could still say it to your face. You were always the strongest of us, and I let you carry that alone because it was easier than fighting for you the way you deserved. I'm sorry. Suarez is not an easy man, but he is an honest one, and he will not let what I failed to stop continue. Trust him the way you trusted me. Maybe more. I love you. D. She folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands. The rain was loud against the window. The refrigerator hummed. The bodega sign buzzed. He said you were honest, she said quietly. I am. He didn't say you were good. Something moved at the corner of Suarez's mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. No, he said. He didn't. Sarah set the letter on the table beside his hands. She looked at it for a moment, the smallness of the paper, the enormity of what it was asking her to step into. Then she looked at him. If I agree to this, she said, I need you to understand something. I am not a person who performs gratitude. I'm not going to be decorative and quiet and make your life easier by disappearing into the background. I've done that for every person who was supposed to be on my side, and it cost me everything Derek apparently knew it cost me. Suarez looked at her steadily. I know. Then why would you want that arrangement? I don't, he said. I want the opposite of that arrangement, that's the point. She searched his face for the angle, for the tell, for the place where the calculation lived. She was good at finding it in people, years of practice, years of being the one in the room who nobody bothered to perform for because nobody was trying to impress her. She couldn't find it. One condition, she said. Name it. You tell me everything Derek knew, all of it, no managing what I can handle. Suarez held her gaze. Agreed. Sarah picked up Derek's letter and walked to the small shelf above the radiator where she kept the things that mattered. She set it there, between a photograph and a candle burned nearly to nothing. Then she turned back to Suarez Matteo, the most dangerous man she had ever stood in a room with, and said, All right. The chair creaked as he stood. Outside, the rain didn't let up. But for the first time in longer than Sarah could accurately remember, she didn't feel like she was standing in it alone. The Matteo estate sat 12 miles outside the city on a property that didn't appear on any public map Sarah had ever seen. She learned this on the drive over. sitting in the back of a black car that smelled of leather and something faintly expensive she couldn't name, watching the city dissolve into trees and gated distance. Suarez sat beside her but didn't crowd her. He looked out his own window. He had not spoken since they left her apartment, and she had not filled the silence, partly because she had nothing to say yet, and partly because she was beginning to understand that silence around this man was not something that needed to be fixed. The house, when it appeared at the end of the long private drive, was not what she expected. She had braced for something aggressive, something that announced itself. What she got was a stone manor set back behind old trees, lit quietly from the ground, the kind of building that had been standing long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. She was shown to a room on the second floor by a woman named Rosa who offered her tea with the no-nonsense warmth of someone who had been running a household through difficult circumstances for a very long time. Sarah accepted the tea. She did not sleep. She met Dex the following morning. He was already in the kitchen when she came downstairs. A lean, sharp-eyed man in his late 30s, dark complexion, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, drinking coffee at the island with the casual authority of someone who spent more time in this kitchen than anyone else in the house. He looked at her when she walked in with the particular assessment of a man who already knew the file and was now comparing it to the subject. That look was the first thing that unsettled her. "You're Dex," she said. "And you're Sarah Calloway." He said it without the soon-to-be Matteo addendum, which she appreciated. "Coffee's fresh." She poured a cup and stood across the island from him. Outside, the grounds were silver with morning, frost on the grass, the trees still and dark against a low white sky. "You looked at me like you already knew what I was going to do when I walked in," she said. Dex smiled into his coffee. "Did I? How long has Suarez been watching me?" The smile didn't disappear. It just settled into something more considered. He set his mug down and looked at her with the careful eyes of a man deciding how much of the truth was his to give. "That's a question for Suarez," he said. "I'm asking you." A beat, then 7 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Sarah set her own mug down with more care than the situation required, because she needed something deliberate to do with her hands. 7 years, she repeated. "Derek asked him to keep an eye on you after your mother died, said the family situation was unstable, said Penelope had always had it out for you, and now there was no one left who would notice." Dex picked his mug back up. "Suarez noticed. For 7 years. He's thorough." She turned and looked out at the frost-covered grounds and tried to decide how she felt about that. It should have felt like a violation. She reached for the outrage and found something more complicated underneath, a strange, disorienting grief for all the years she had believed no one was paying attention. "What does that mean exactly?" she said. "Kept tabs." "It means he knew when you lost the job at Hargrove and Mills, the one Penelope's boyfriend blacklisted you from. It means he knew when the landlord on your previous apartment raised your rent by 40% the month after Penelope had dinner with his wife." Dex's voice was even, factual, like he was reading from a ledger, which she suspected he might actually have memorized. "It means there were 3 occasions where Penelope made moves that could have genuinely hurt you, and on all 3 occasions, something happened to interrupt those moves before they landed." Sarah turned back around. "What kind of something?" "The kind Suarez handles personally." She stared at him. He intervened. 3 times, without telling you, without telling Derek. Dex met her eyes. Derek only asked him to watch. She absorbed this in layers, the way a person processes something that rearranges too much to take in all at once. Penelope had been trying to destroy her for longer than she'd known, and someone had been standing between them in the dark, unseen, unannounced, asking for nothing. She thought about every moment in those years when something bad had almost happened, and then hadn't. The job offer that came through at the last possible moment. The landlord who had abruptly reversed course. The reference that materialized from nowhere when she needed it most. She had chalked all of it up to luck, to the universe occasionally deciding to be fair. It hadn't been the universe. "He should have told me," she said. "Probably," Dex agreed. I had a right to know someone was. She stopped, pressed her fingers to the edge of the counter. I had a right to know. You did. Dex was quiet for a moment. Then, for what it's worth, I think he didn't tell you because telling you would have meant explaining how it started. And explaining how it started would have meant admitting it had become something different from what Derek asked for. Sarah looked at him. He stopped doing it because Derek asked him to, Dex said quietly, a long time ago. The frost outside caught the first pale edge of morning sun and threw it back in pieces across the kitchen floor. If you think people like Penelope, who scheme and steal and quietly dismantle someone else's life just to feel superior, are the lowest form of scum, hit that subscribe button right now and stand against that kind of greed. People like Sarah deserve better, and so do you. Sarah picked up her coffee and didn't say anything else, but she was already walking toward the room where she knew Suarez would be. She had questions, and this time she wasn't going to let him answer them with silence. She found him in the study. It was a long room at the back of the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 2 walls, a fireplace that was actually in use, and a desk that looked like it had been making serious decisions for about 100 years. Suarez stood at the window with a phone to his ear, speaking in the low, clipped cadence of a man issuing a conclusion rather than a request. He saw her when she came in. He didn't hold up a finger or mouth 1 minute the way people do when they want you to feel accommodated. He just held her gaze while he finished the call and set the phone face down on the desk. You talked to Dex, he said. 7 years, Suarez. He didn't flinch at it, didn't reach for an excuse. He pulled out the chair across from his desk and waited. She sat, not because she was ready to be civil, but because she wanted to be at eye level for this conversation. Derek asked me to watch, he said, settling into his own chair. What it became after that was my own doing. I won't dress it up. What did it become? He was quiet for a moment in the way she was beginning to recognize, not evasion, just precision. He chose his words the way other men chose weapons. It became wanting to make sure you were all right, and then it became something I didn't have a clean name for. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. And the 3 times you intervened. I would do all 3 again. She believed him. That was the uncomfortable part. She believed him completely, and she wasn't sure yet if that was good judgment or the beginning of something she didn't have the experience to navigate. She let it settle, filed it in the same place as everything else she wasn't ready to feel. Tell me about the business, she said. All of it. You promised me no managing. Something shifted in his expression. A subtle recalibration, like a man who had expected to keep defending one thing and was now being asked to open an entirely different door. He studied her face. Then he leaned back and told her. The Matteo syndicate had not started with violence. That was the first thing she hadn't expected. It had started with Suarez's grandfather, a man named Victor who arrived in this country with $70 and a working knowledge of how broken systems could be navigated by someone with no patience for waiting in lines that were never going to move. Victor hadn't built a criminal empire. He had built a parallel economy, for people the banks wouldn't lend to, the courts wouldn't protect, the landlords wouldn't house unless they wanted to be exploited in the process. 3 generations later. The Matteo name meant something different in different rooms. In City Hall, it meant a problem. In federal databases, it meant a target. But in the neighborhoods where Victor had started, in the communities that still existed because someone had once decided they were worth protecting, it meant something closer to a covenant. That doesn't make it clean, Suarez said. He wasn't asking her to be impressed. He was just being accurate. There is violence in it. There are things I have done and ordered done that I won't describe to you over morning coffee. But there is also a code. And the code is the thing I will never compromise. What's the code? She asked. You don't touch civilians. You don't touch families. You honor your word absolutely, even when it costs you. And you never, under any circumstances, use your power to prey on people who have nothing. He paused. Penelope has been doing the last one her entire life with no consequences. That ends now. Sarah was quiet. Outside the study window, 2 men were crossing the grounds in the cold morning light, unhurried, professional, the particular gait of people who were always working even when they appeared not to be. She had noticed others like them at the edges of the property since she arrived. She was beginning to understand that the estate wasn't just a home, it was infrastructure. Over the following 3 days, she learned its rhythms. Mornings were operations, calls, meetings, decisions made in the study with the door half open while Rosa moved through the house with coffee and quiet authority. Afternoons were quieter but never still. Men came and went through the back entrance. Documents moved through the house in manila envelopes that nobody explained and nobody needed to. Evenings were the only time the house exhaled, dinner at the long kitchen table, Dex usually present, conversation that was sometimes business and sometimes unexpectedly ordinary. She learned that Suarez did not eat lunch. She learned that he read actual books, dense ones, history mostly, and that the shelf behind his desk was not decorative. She learned that the men who worked for him were not afraid of him in the way she had assumed. They were loyal to him, which was different. Fear made people obedient. Loyalty made them careful. She also learned, slowly and without fanfare, that the estate staff had been quietly making space for her in ways that hadn't been announced. A second key on the hook by the back door. Her preferred coffee appearing in the kitchen without her having mentioned it. Rosa asking, one evening, in the most offhand tone imaginable, whether she had any dietary restrictions before the week's shopping was done. She mentioned it to Suarez on the 3rd night, standing in the hallway outside her room. "You told them to take care of me," she said. "I told them you were home," he said, and then he walked away down the hall before she could work out what to do with that. Sarah stood in the quiet of the corridor for a long moment. Then she went inside, and for the first time since Derek died, slept without waking once. The first message came on a Tuesday. Sarah almost didn't see it. She had been in the estate's library, a smaller, warmer room than the study, with lower shelves and a window seat she had quietly claimed over the past week, reading through documents Suarez had left for her without comment. Financial records, property holdings, the shape of the empire drawn in numbers and legal language. He had meant it about no managing. The documents were unfiltered, and some of what she read required her to sit very still for a moment before turning the page. Her phone buzzed on the cushion beside her. A text from a number she still had saved under Penelope. "Do not answer after 9 p.m., a note she had added 3 years ago after a particular incident involving a ruined job interview and a smile so innocent it made Sarah's back teeth ache. "I heard about this arrangement. I'm worried about you, Sarah. I hope you know what you've gotten yourself into. People are talking." Sarah read it once, set the phone face down on the cushion, picked up the next document. But the message had done what it was designed to do. It had planted a seed in the 3 seconds it took to read it, and the seed didn't care that she had put the phone down. It grew anyway. The second message came Thursday. This one was longer. Penelope had apparently spoken to someone. She was always speaking to someone. Her entire life was a network of strategic someones who had direct knowledge of what happened to the last woman Suarez Matteo had been involved with. The details were vague in the way that made them impossible to disprove. Something about a woman in Philadelphia. Something about her disappearing from public life suddenly and completely. "I just think you deserve to know the full picture, Sarah. I've always looked out for you." "You know that." Sarah stared at the last line for a long time. She knew, intellectually, that Penelope had never looked out for her a single day in her life. She knew it the way she knew her own name, factually, completely, without room for doubt. And yet something in the phrasing caught in her chest anyway, because Penelope was extraordinarily good at one specific thing. She spoke the language of concern so fluently that even the people who knew better sometimes forgot, for one unguarded moment, that the concern was a costume. She didn't reply. But that night at dinner, she was quieter than usual, and she caught Suarez watching her from across the table with that particular stillness of his, not intrusive, just attentive, and she looked away before he could ask. By the following week, the messages had evolved. Penelope had shifted from texts to a carefully orchestrated series of third-party whispers, the kind that arrived through mutual acquaintances, old colleagues, a woman named Trisha from Sarah's previous job who called out of nowhere to ask how she was doing, and then, in the same breath, mentioned that she had run into Penelope recently who was so concerned, and had said some things that Trisha felt Sarah probably ought to know. Sarah listened to Trisha with the phone pressed to her ear and the window of her room at her back, and understood with cold clarity what was happening. Penelope wasn't attacking her directly. She was salting the ground, planting doubt in the minds of every person Sarah might turn to, building a version of the story in which Sarah was fragile, confused, and in danger, so that by the time anything happened, the narrative was already established. The woman in Philadelphia, a pattern of controlling behavior. He isolates them, Sarah. That's what people like him do. She ended the call with Trisha and sat on the edge of the window seat and made herself think clearly. Suarez had not isolated her. He had given her documents, access, information she hadn't asked for. He had told her the truth about the business without softening it. He had said she was home and then let her figure out what that meant on her own terms. None of that was the architecture of control. She knew what control looked like. She had grown up inside Penelope's version of it. But doubt is not logical. That was the thing about Penelope's particular brand of poison. It didn't need to be believed to do damage. It just needed to be present. A splinter under the skin, too small to see, just large enough to make everything it touched slightly tender. She found Suarez in the study that evening after dinner. "Tell me about the woman in Philadelphia," she said from the doorway. He looked up from the desk. Something moved across his face, recognition, and beneath it, something that looked almost like resignation. He set down his pen. "Sit down." "I'd rather stand." He accepted that. Her name was Diane Rowlands. We were involved for 8 months 4 years ago. When it ended, she moved to Philadelphia to be closer to her family. She is currently married, has a daughter, and runs a catering business. He held Sarah's gaze. "She is not missing. She is not a cautionary tale. Whoever told you otherwise was building a story out of nothing." Sarah studied his face. "And there's nothing else?" "Nothing I'm ashamed of." She nodded slowly, pushed off the doorframe. She was almost back into the hallway when he spoke again. "Sarah," she stopped. "Whoever is feeding you this, they're not worried about you. They're worried about themselves. Don't let someone else's panic become your doubt." She didn't answer, but she heard it. If you despise toxic bullies like Penelope, people who tear others down, manufacture fear, and dress their cruelty up as concern just to feel superior, smash that like button and comment, respect for everyone, so we know you aren't standing with the manipulator. Back in her room, Sarah deleted every message Penelope had sent without reading them again. Then she blocked the number. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning. The wedding took place on a Friday morning with no announcement and no audience. Rosa had laid a dress on Sarah's bed the night before, ivory silk, simple cut, nothing that screamed occasion but everything that understood it. No note, no explanation, just the dress, and beside it, a pair of pearl earrings in a small velvet box that Sarah recognized immediately as not being new. They had the particular luster of something worn and loved and carefully kept. She put them on without asking where they came from. Downstairs, the study had been quietly rearranged. The desk pushed back. 2 tall arrangements of white flowers, gardenias, she thought, though she couldn't have said why she knew that, standing on either side of the fireplace. A man she hadn't met before stood near the mantel with the calm, unhurried presence of someone who officiated things regularly and understood that less ceremony was sometimes more dignity. Dex was there. Rosa stood near the door with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something carefully neutral that didn't quite conceal the fact that she had been crying recently. Suarez stood with his back to the fireplace in a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit men who don't need them to announce anything. He watched her come down the stairs. He didn't smile, that wasn't his register, but something in his face opened slightly, like a room with more light than you expected. Sarah walked across the study floor in ivory silk and pearl earrings that belonged to someone else's history, and she thought about Derek, and she did not cry. She saved that for later, carefully, the way she had learned to do with everything that mattered. The ceremony was 11 minutes long. The officiant spoke quietly and without theater. The words were the standard ones, the old, worn words that had survived centuries of human optimism, because they contained something true at their center despite everything. When it came to the vows, Suarez spoke them in the same low, unhurried register he used for everything, and she understood that for him there was no tonal difference between a vow and any other form of commitment. He meant all of them the same way, completely. She said her own vows clearly. She had decided in the middle of the previous night that she would not whisper them. Whatever this was, complicated and strange and built on grief and danger, and 7 years of being watched by a man who was standing 3 feet away from her holding her hand, it deserved to be spoken at full volume. When the officiant said the words that made it legal and final, Suarez slid a ring onto her finger. Plain platinum band, no stone, no flourish. The kind of ring that meant what it said without decoration. She looked at it on her hand for one long moment before she looked back up at him. He was already looking at her. Rosa made coffee. Dex shook Suarez's hand and kissed Sarah's cheek with surprising gentleness and said, very quietly into her ear, "Welcome to the family," in a way that made the phrase mean something she hadn't expected it to mean. She thanked him and meant it. The public appearance was that evening. A dinner at the Caldwell Hotel, one of those grand, chandelier-heavy rooms that existed specifically to make power visible. The syndicate maintained several relationships in spaces like this. Legitimate businesses, civic associations, the careful architecture of a criminal organization that understood the value of being seen in the right rooms by the right people. Sarah understood this walking in. She had dressed for it a deep navy dress, her dark hair up, the pearl earrings still in because she had decided they were hers now. Suarez's hand rested at the small of her back as they moved through the entrance, and she felt the shift in the room before she saw it. The subtle reorientation of attention, the recalibration. People looked at Suarez Matteo the way people look at weather, instinctively, with an awareness that what he did next would affect everyone in the vicinity. But tonight, they were also looking at her. Not with Penelope's brand of assessment, the quick, dismissive scan that concluded not a threat before moving on. This was something different. This was the room trying to understand what it meant that she was here, at his side, with his ring on her finger and his hand at her back. She let them look. She had spent a long time making herself small in rooms like this. She had no interest in doing it tonight. Suarez introduced her to 3 men in the first 20 minutes, associates. She understood, the civilian-facing edge of the syndicate's various operations. Each of them shook her hand with the specific courtesy of people who had been told to take her seriously and were deciding in real time whether the instruction was necessary. She spoke to each of them directly, asked questions that demonstrated she had been reading those unfiltered documents, and watched the calculation in their eyes shift from assessment to something closer to respect. Between the second and third introduction, Suarez leaned slightly toward her and said, very quietly, "You're doing something most people take months to figure out." "What's that?" "Making them understand that knowing you is in their interest." She considered that. "Is it?" "Yes," he said, without elaborating. But his hand pressed slightly firmer at her back, and she understood it was the only punctuation the sentence needed. Later, across the room, she saw Penelope. She was standing near the bar with a man Sarah didn't recognize, holding a champagne glass and wearing an expression so composed it could only have been constructed. Their eyes met across 30 feet of candlelight and polished floor. Penelope smiled first, small, controlled, the smile of a woman who was already planning her next move. Sarah held her gaze and did not smile back. Suarez had felt the shift. Without looking across the room, without asking, his hand moved from her back to her side, unhurried, steady, the gesture of a man closing ranks. He already knew. It started with a phone call she wasn't supposed to overhear. Sarah had been crossing the rear corridor toward the kitchen when she caught her name through the half-open door of the east sitting room. Not her full name, just Sarah, dropped into a sentence with a particular lightness that told her everything about how the speaker thought of her. She stopped walking. The voice belonged to a man named Garrett. She had met him twice. A syndicate associate, outer circle, the kind of man who wore good watches and said very little in rooms where Suarez was present and apparently considerably more in rooms where he wasn't. He was speaking to someone on the phone. The door was half open because it hadn't occurred to him to close it fully, which told her something about how much he thought he needed to be careful. She has no idea what she's looking at, Garrett was saying. Suarez put documents in front of her to make her feel included. That's all it is. Give it 3 months and she'll be decorative furniture like every other woman who's tried to get a foothold in this operation. Sarah stood in the corridor for a count of 5. Then she pushed the door open and walked in. Garrett looked up from his phone with the expression of a man whose primary feeling was irritation at being interrupted rather than any awareness that he should be embarrassed. "Finish your call," Sarah said pleasantly. "I'll wait." He ended it, whether out of instinct or the particular tone she had used, the one she had learned from years of being underestimated and deciding, finally, to stop accommodating it. She couldn't say. He set the phone down and looked at her with the careful blankness of a man recalibrating. "Those documents," she said, "contain a discrepancy in the Harlow Street property accounts going back 14 months. Approximately $60,000 cycling through a shell entity that doesn't appear in any of the primary ledgers. I flagged it this morning." She tilted her head slightly. "I thought you might want to know before I mentioned it to Suarez this evening, since your signature appears on 2 of the relevant transfers." The room was very quiet. Garrett's expression moved through several stages in rapid succession. She watched all of them without commentary. "I'm not your enemy, Garrett," she said. "I'm also not furniture. I'd suggest remembering the difference." She left him with that and walked to the kitchen to make herself coffee, and her hands were entirely steady the whole time. She told Suarez that evening. All of it, the overheard call, the confrontation, the discrepancy in the accounts. She set her notes on the desk in front of him and let him read while she stood at the window with her coffee. He read without interrupting. When he finished, he looked up at her and was quiet for a moment in that way of his that she had stopped misreading as distance, and now understood was just the space he gave things before he responded to them properly. "You found this in the documents I gave you," he said. "You said no managing." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile. He rarely arrived at a full smile, but the precursor to one, the territory just before. "How long did you know before you confronted him?" "About 40 minutes. I wanted to be sure of the numbers first." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 90 seconds, the content of which Sarah was not privy to, but the tone of which was unmistakable. When he set it down, he said, "Garrett won't be a problem." "I didn't need you to handle it." "I know," Suarez said. "That's not why I made the call." He looked at her directly. "I made the call because in this organization, when someone disrespects my wife, there are consequences. Not for your sake, because disrespect is a door and doors left open invite worse things through." He paused. "You handled Garrett. I closed the door." Sarah considered this. The logic of it was not entirely different from the logic she had used her entire career, the difference being that she had never previously had anyone willing to close the door behind her. Word moved quickly in the Matteo estate. That was something she had already learned. By the following morning, the quality of attention in the house had shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. People looked at her differently, not with deference exactly, more with the recalibrated awareness of individuals who had updated their understanding of what they were dealing with. Dex found her in the library after breakfast and leaned against the doorframe with his coffee and said, "Garrett's been reassigned to the Portland office." "Is Portland unpleasant?" "It's Portland in February." He sipped his coffee. "So yes." Sarah turned a page. "Good." Over the following 2 weeks, she established herself in the estate's daily operations not through assertion, but through simple, consistent competence. She sat in on the morning briefings. She asked questions that cut through to the center of things. She caught 2 more accounting irregularities, smaller ones, different sources, and documented them without drama and placed them on Suarez's desk. He started leaving the morning briefings until she was present. She noticed but didn't comment. What she also noticed was that the outer circle associates, the Garretts of the organization, the men who had looked at her at the Caldwell Hotel and seen decoration, had stopped looking at her that way. They now looked at her the way they looked at Dex, the way they looked at anything with teeth. Penelope, through her network of carefully placed someones, would have heard about Garrett by now. Sarah thought about that occasionally in the evenings, sitting in the window seat of the library with the grounds going dark outside, the frost returning, the house warm around her. She thought about Penelope hearing the news and recalculating, realizing that the woman she had spent years diminishing had stepped into a room Penelope couldn't follow her into and found, to everyone's surprise including her own, that she fit there perfectly. If you believe that people like Penelope, who thrive on controlling others, keeping them small, stealing their confidence along with everything else, deserve to lose every advantage they have built on someone else's silence, subscribe right now and comment, "I stand for independence," so we know you aren't standing with the controller. She hoped it kept Penelope up at night. She suspected it did. She noticed the book first. It was a Tuesday evening, and Sarah had come back to her room after a late briefing to find everything exactly as she had left it, except for a book on her nightstand that had moved approximately 3 inches to the left. She knew because she had a habit, unconscious and long-standing, of placing things parallel to edges. The book was no longer parallel to anything. She stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it. Then she looked at the rest of the room. Nothing else was visibly disturbed. The surface of the room was perfect, which was, she understood slowly, the problem. Someone had been in here and been careful, but not careful enough about the book, or perhaps not aware that she was the kind of person who noticed a 3-inch shift in the position of a nightstand object. She didn't touch anything. She went back downstairs and found Dex. It took his team 4 hours. Sarah sat in the library while they worked, drinking tea she didn't taste, listening to the quiet movement of people above her, and telling herself to think clearly. Suarez had been in a call when she came down. Dex had taken one look at her face and asked only one question, "Did you touch anything?" And when she said no, he had moved with the swift, focused efficiency of a man for whom this was not the first time. Suarez came to the library doorway at the 2-hour mark. He looked at her in a way that asked the question without asking it. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you are," he said. "That's not what I'm checking." She looked at him. "Then what are you checking?" "Whether you're angry or frightened." He came into the room and sat across from her, forearms on his knees, the posture of a man settling in rather than passing through. The response is different depending on the answer. "Both," she said honestly. He nodded like that was the right answer. "Good. Frightened means you understand the stakes. Angry means you're not going to disappear on me." She almost said something to that. She let it pass. Dex came down at the 4-hour mark with a folder and an expression she hadn't seen on him before, a particular flatness that she was beginning to understand, meant he was containing something he felt strongly about. He laid it on the table in front of them both. The planted material was thorough. She had to give Penelope that, or whoever Penelope had hired, because this had the fingerprints of professional construction rather than personal rage. A series of printed correspondence, formatted to mirror the estate's internal communication style, bearing Sarah's name as author. The letters detailed the transfer of syndicate intelligence to a rival family operating out of the Mid-Atlantic. Names, dates, operational specifics drawn from real events, but recontextualized, repurposed, rewoven into a narrative in which Sarah Calloway had been selling information since the day she arrived. It was designed to be found, not by Sarah, by Suarez, or by someone in the inner circle who would bring it to Suarez with the grave, regretful energy of a person delivering terrible but necessary news. Sarah looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. "She built a version of me," she finally said. "She's been doing that my whole life, building a version of me that's easier to destroy than the real one." Neither Dex nor Suarez said anything. They let her have the observation. "What flagged it?" Suarez asked Dex. 3 things. Dex turned the folder to face Suarez. The paper stock is commercial grade. Everything generated internally uses a specific bonded stock. We've used the same supplier for 11 years. Second, one of the contact names in the correspondence is a man who died in October. Whoever built this used an outdated roster. He paused. Third, the timestamps on 2 of the documents place them on the same evening Sarah was sitting across from you in the study until midnight. I checked the security log. The room was quiet for a moment. She made mistakes, Sarah said. 3 of them, Dex confirmed. Professionals don't usually make 3. Either she was working fast or she was working with someone who didn't have complete information. Or both, Suarez said. He closed the folder with a finality that had nothing performative about it. She wanted this found before the gala. He looked at Sarah. The annual event is in 11 days. She needed you removed before then, or the appearance of you compromised, so that whatever she has planned for that night lands without interference. Sarah absorbed this. She's planning something at the gala. She's been planning something at the gala, Suarez said. This was insurance, in case what she has planned isn't enough on its own. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the grounds were dark and still, the frost catching the edge of the security lights in small, cold glints across the grass. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked out at it for a moment, and Sarah watched the set of his shoulders and understood that whatever was happening behind his eyes was not panic and was not even anger in the conventional sense. It was the particular, focused cold of a man who had just been given everything he needed. She doesn't know we found it, Sarah said. No, Suarez said, she doesn't. So as far as she's concerned, the trap worked. He turned from the window. In the low light of the library, his expression was unreadable in the way that had once unsettled her, and now, she realized, did not. She had learned to read the stillness. Underneath it, at the very controlled center of Suarez Matteo, something had locked into place. Let her think that, he said quietly. Let her walk into that gala believing she has already won. If you are absolutely sick of backstabbing snakes like Penelope, people who manufacture lies, plant false evidence, and try to destroy innocent people from the shadows just to satisfy their own jealous, vicious agendas, hit that like button right now and let me know you're not standing with the fraud. He picked up the folder from the table. I'll build the counter from here. Sarah looked at him. I want to be part of it. He didn't hesitate. I know, he said. That's why I'm telling you everything. The Caldwell Hotel's grand ballroom held 200 people comfortably, and another 50 if you were willing to let comfort become secondary to presence. Tonight it held both. The syndicate's legitimate faces, their civic associations, their carefully maintained civilian adjacencies, all gathered under the weight of 3 chandeliers, and the collective understanding that the Matteo annual gala was not merely a social event. It was a demonstration, a renewal of terms. A room full of people reminding each other, in the language of black tie and good wine, exactly where they stood. Sarah knew this walking in. She wore black tonight, a simple, long column of it that Rosa had laid out without comment, and the pearl earrings again, because they were hers now and she wanted Penelope to see them. Suarez's hand rested at her back. She had noticed over the past 11 days that the placement of his hand had shifted incrementally. No longer the small of her back, now slightly higher, a broader contact, the geography of a man who had stopped thinking about where he put his hand and was simply putting it where it wanted to be. She didn't mention it, but she noticed. Penelope arrived 40 minutes into the evening. She came with the man from the hotel bar. Sarah had learned his name in the intervening days, a mid-level associate from a rival operation named Bryce Hollander, which told her everything about the nature of the alliance. Penelope had found someone with access to the right information and the wrong loyalties, and she had made herself useful to him in exchange for what she needed. It was, Sarah reflected, entirely on brand. Penelope had always understood how to make herself the solution to someone else's problem. She looked stunning, which was also on brand. Burgundy dress, hair down, the particular confidence of a woman who had convinced herself that tonight was already decided. She moved through the room with the easy grace of someone who had rehearsed for this specific evening and was pleased with how the rehearsal had gone. She spotted Sarah across the room and held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking away. The ghost of a smile. "I've already won." Sarah held her champagne glass and said nothing and waited. Suarez disappeared from her side at the 90-minute mark. She knew where he was going. They had discussed it in the library over the past 11 days. In the precise and methodical way she had come to understand was how he approached everything that mattered. No drama in the planning, no flourish. Just the clean, sequential logic of a man who understood that the most devastating thing you could do to a carefully constructed lie was simply to tell the truth louder. She watched Penelope across the room, watched her speak to Hollander with the focused intensity of a countdown, watched her check the time twice in the space of 10 minutes. Then she watched Suarez step onto the low platform at the head of the room, where the evening's host typically offered remarks, and she watched the room's attention follow him the way attention always followed him, completely, immediately, without resistance. He thanked the guests, briefly, without theater. He acknowledged the evening's charitable component, and then he paused in the way that made the room very still. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to address something directly, because this organization was built on a code, and the first term of that code is honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. Especially then." Sarah watched Penelope's expression shift, the first small crack in the composure. Suarez nodded to Dex, who stood near the room's side entrance with a laptop connected to the display screen behind the platform. The screen came to life. He was methodical. That was the word for it. Not theatrical, not cruel methodical, in the way of a man who respected the truth enough to present it without embellishment and trusted it to do its own work. First, the forged documents, displayed side by side with the estate's genuine internal correspondence, the paper stock difference annotated, the timestamp discrepancies highlighted in the plainest possible terms. He identified the commercial print shop where the stock had been purchased. He showed the purchase receipt. The name on it was not Sarah's. Then the outdated roster, the dead man's name appearing in correspondence that claimed to be current. He showed the obituary. He showed the date. He showed the gap between what the documents claimed and what was true. Then the security logs. Sarah's movements on the evenings in question, documented and timestamped, placing her consistently and verifiably somewhere other than where the fabricated narrative required her to be. He presented Hollander's connection to the rival operation without drama, simply laid the organizational chart on the screen and let the room follow the lines to their conclusions. Then he showed the communication records between Hollander and Penelope going back 4 months, the point at which their collaboration had begun and the shape of what it had been building toward. He did not raise his voice once. Penelope stood in the center of the room, and Sarah watched the composure leave her face in stages. The smile first, then the easy confidence, then the carefully maintained performance of innocence, until what was left was just a woman standing in a burgundy dress with 200 people looking at her and nowhere left to go. Hollander had already moved toward the exit. 2 of Dex's men had already moved to match him. "I don't deal in rumors," Suarez said from the platform, his voice carrying the same unhurried weight it always carried. "I deal in what's true. What's true tonight is that my wife is exactly who she has always been, and everyone in this room now knows exactly who is responsible for suggesting otherwise." He stepped down from the platform. The room was very quiet. Penelope looked across the space between them and found Sarah looking back at her, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the simple, steady gaze of a woman who had nothing left to prove. If you find dishonest, manipulative people like Penelope, who construct elaborate lies, destroy innocent reputations, and smile while they do it, absolutely repulsive, subscribe right now and comment "Truth always wins" to show the world you aren't siding with a liar. Suarez appeared at Sarah's side. His hand returned to its place at her back. "It's done," he said quietly. Sarah looked at the room, at 200 people recalibrating, at Penelope standing alone in Burgundy with nothing left in her hands, and exhaled for what felt like the first time all evening. "Yes," she said, "it is." The ballroom emptied slowly, the way rooms do after something significant has happened. People leaving in clusters, voices low, the particular energy of 200 individuals processing the same event from 200 different angles and needing the company of someone they trusted to do it properly. Sarah stayed until nearly the end. Not out of obligation, not to be seen. She stayed because leaving felt like flinching, and she had done enough flinching in her life to recognize it and refuse it when it presented itself. She stood with Suarez's hand at her back and spoke to the people who approached her, and more people approached her now than had at the beginning of the evening, which told her something precise about the nature of the room's recalibration. And she was present and steady and entirely herself in a way that felt new and also, strangely, ancient. Like something that had always been there, waiting for the conditions that would allow it. Penelope left within 20 minutes of the platform. Sarah didn't watch her go. She didn't need to. The drive back to the estate was quiet. Not the careful quiet of two people managing their distance, but the settled quiet of two people who had passed through something together and didn't need to immediately dismantle it with words. The city moved past the windows in the dark, lights and rain-slicked streets, and the particular beauty of a place that doesn't care what happened to you tonight and is just continuing to exist, which Sarah found oddly comforting. She looked at the platinum band on her finger in the dark of the back seat. Simple, no flourish, meaning exactly what it said. "You knew she'd be there tonight," Sarah said, not an accusation, just a fact she was placing on the table between them. "Yes. You planned all of it from the moment we found the documents." "Yes." She turned to look at him. His profile in the passing light was exactly what it had always been, severe, still, the face of a man who had never needed the world's approval and had consequently never been shaped by the absence of it. She had spent weeks learning to read what was underneath that stillness. She thought she was getting competent at it. "You could have moved faster," she said. "You had everything you needed within the first 48 hours. "I could have," he agreed. "But you waited for the gala. You waited for the most public possible moment." He turned to look at her then. "She spent years doing quiet damage to you in rooms where no one was watching. I wanted the correction to happen in a room where everyone was." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the city gave way to the darkness of the private road, the trees closing in on either side, the estate lights appearing at the end of the drive like something that had been waiting patiently for their return. She didn't say anything, but she reached across the seat and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm upward and held it, and that was sufficient. The weeks that followed had a different quality to them. Penelope's network collapsed with the speed that networks built on performance always collapse when the performance is exposed. Quickly, completely, each carefully maintained connection severing itself with the self-preserving efficiency of people who had never been loyal to anything except their own positioning. The Ashford family issued no statement. They simply became unavailable, which was its own kind of statement. Hollander was handled through channels Sarah didn't ask about, and Suarez didn't detail. She understood this was one of the places where her knowledge ended and his world began, and she had made her peace with that boundary in the same way she had made her peace with all the other complicated truths of the life she had stepped into. It was not a clean world, but it was an honest one, on its own terms, and she had lived long enough in dishonest ones to know the difference. The estate settled into a new rhythm that contained her fully rather than accommodating her partially. She sat at the morning briefings as a matter of course now, not as an observer, not as Suarez's wife present by extension, but as someone whose read on a situation had been sought and deferred to often enough that seeking it had become habit. Dex consulted her on the accounting irregularities as a standing arrangement. Rosa had stopped explaining the house to her and started asking her opinion on it, which felt like a different and more meaningful form of welcome. One morning in late November, she was in the study reviewing the Harlow Street property accounts. Fully corrected now, the shell entity dissolved, the $60,000 traced and recovered, when Suarez came in and sat across the desk from her and watched her work for a moment before speaking. "Derek told me something the last time I saw him," he said. She looked up. He said the problem was never that Sarah couldn't handle the world. The problem was the world kept handing her a version of itself designed to make her believe she couldn't. He held her gaze. He was right. Sarah set her pen down. She thought about the third-floor walk-up and the buzzing light and the stack of bills she hadn't moved in time. She thought about 7 years of small, quiet sabotages and the 7 years of something else running parallel to them in the dark, unseen. She thought about Derek's handwriting on an envelope and a ring with no flourish and a man who had closed doors behind her without asking for credit. She thought about who she had been when Suarez Matteo knocked on her door. She thought about who she was now, sitting on his side of the desk in the house that was hers, with his name and his ring and the absolute, unambiguous understanding that she had not been remade by any of this. She had simply finally been given the conditions to be fully what she already was. Justice had been served, not the loud, dramatic kind, the real kind, the permanent kind, the kind that doesn't require an audience because it lives in the changed circumstances of a person's actual life. If you believe that everyone, regardless of how long they've been overlooked, undermined, or quietly stolen from, deserves a chance at a fair and powerful life, subscribe right now and comment, "I stand for justice," so we know you aren't siding with the people who tried to keep her down. "I know," Sarah said simply. She picked her pen back up. Outside, the November grounds were iron gray and frost-covered and entirely still. Inside, the fire was going, the house was warm, and Sarah Calloway, Sarah Matteo, worked quietly at the desk of the empire that was now, undeniably, also hers. She had stopped refusing what she deserved. And she did not intend to start again. And